Hello, everyone. I decided to brave the storm and make my way to my office at SSU to record this talk today. It's late Saturday afternoon. I've done that mostly because the rest of my family is at home, and the kids even were able to have a friend over as we've seen restrictions lift a little in New Brunswick. As it turns out, we could have met in person tomorrow, but that wasn't anticipated, so we're doing one more online talk this week. Also, I'm pretty sure most of us will be digging ourselves out of our homes by the morning. I'm very much looking forward to being back together in person next week. So, speaking of this place and St. Stephen's University, we've just started a new semester, and one of the things I've been organizing in my role at SSU is our weekly fireside chats. This is a time where we all come together to listen to someone in the community do a short talk. This term, the theme is focused on sharing the stories that brought us here. And it's already been a really meaningful time to hear people share about how they came to the SSU community, and in many cases, why they stayed. So I'm not sharing at SSU this term, but I found myself thinking about my own journey to St. Stephen and the connection I found here at St. Croix Church, previously St. Croix Vineyard, and of course with the university as well. The other reason this is at the forefront of my mind is because I've been meeting together with a lovely group of people from SCC who have been invited to an imagination team focusing on the hopes and dreams of the future of St. Croix Church. As a group, we decided to begin by briefly sharing what our personal church background and experience has been, where we find ourselves now as it relates to church community, and the things that we really hope and long for. So this has all felt like an invitation for me to reflect specifically on my church experience and how I ended up here. As I've done this, the word at the forefront of my mind has been longing. So I'm going to share a little bit about that longing with you today. One thing you might not know about me is that as a teenager, I would often find myself highly engaged in theological debates. These debates centered primarily around the doctrine of hell and the teachings surrounding eternal damnation. An interesting thing to be obsessed with, I know. But one memory from the time I've been returning to often is of a youth night our pastor attended. At some point in the evening, I found myself sitting with him and two other boys talking about these different perspectives, looking at verses and debating angles. We were passionate about our arguments. Mine looked something like, what about the verse in Romans that says nothing can separate you from the love of God? We weren't exactly listening to each other, but we were trying to prove a point. Eventually, I looked at my pastor and asked, if both of these views can be supported by scripture, how do we know the truth? It can't really be one or the other, can it? I remember a tender smile and a nod as if to say, you're onto something now. This wasn't enough for me because I knew our denomination had a clear set of beliefs on this. So I asked, but what do you think? Then he offered an object lesson of sorts. He stretched out both his arms as far as he could, making the shape he knew I'd associate with Jesus on the cross. And he said, that these two ways of seeing are as far apart as they can get. I think the truth must live somewhere in the middle, in the heart of Jesus. Now, this response didn't give me the clarity I thought I wanted, and it didn't help me win my argument with those boys. But I remember it soothing something deeper inside of me. It opened my heart to mystery, to the possibility there wasn't a clear answer for everything. Throughout my teenage years, I had a few other encounters that softened me in this way. I didn't recognize them as spiritual awakenings at that time, but rather as alarming, fear-inducing cracks in the foundation the church I loved had provided for me. I did not welcome these cracks. In fact, I thought I might fall right into them and be lost forever. As I matured, though, I began to recognize the complexity and importance of these cracks within me. And today, the picture that forms in my imagination is a lot like Leonard Cohen's line from his song Anthem. He sings, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." I now imagine that it has always been the light inside of me that permeated through the foundation, cracking it open. Because those cracks created an awareness of what was wrong with that foundation, and they awakened a longing in me for something better. It is following that longing that brought me to St. Stephen. At a certain point in my mid to late 20s, in the throes of early motherhood, I decided to give up on the hope that I would find a church community that might make room for these longings. And I chose to settle for a community where the people were kind, practiced love, justice, and compassion in a way that made sense to me, and where my young children could grow up surrounded by the faith I'd enjoyed in church communities most of my life. To my surprise, I found this and more at a Vineyard Church in Winnipeg, which was no small thing. But eventually, as the fog of early motherhood began to lift and my own heart was awakened through the love of this church, those cracks came calling, or rather, the light within me, and I remembered my longings for a theology and a church that made room for doubt, that embraced mystery, that was open and fully inclusive of the LGBTQ+ community, and that worked to disentangle Christianity from colonialism and patriarchy. I longed for a faith that refused to exclude anyone. So I started down a path of formal learning, and I decided to begin in the place I was in. I registered for online courses through the Vineyard Institute. I was ready to re-engage. But just before the courses began, a friend and I took off to attend the first Why Christian conference organized by the late Rachel Held Evans and Nadia Bolz-Weber in the fall of 2015. Every speaker at this conference was brilliant, and they openly grappled with the question, why? But two speakers stood out for me, Rachel Murr and Emily Swan, one a former Vineyard pastor in the States. Both shared their heart-wrenching stories of belonging to Vineyard communities and then being cast out because of their sexuality. While these women were now happily married to each other, and Emily had gone on to plant Blue Ocean Faith Church with her co-pastor Ken Wilson, who left the Vineyard at her side, their pain was palpable. It took my breath away. I returned to Winnipeg determined to find out what Vineyard Canada was actively doing or not doing to reckon with the harm done to LGBTQ+ folks in the church, and what they planned to do to right it. And I was given the name of one person, Peter Fitch. Peter Fitch, a Vineyard pastor and professor at St. Stephen's University, had written a book, Learning to Interpret Toward Love. I cannot overemphasize what the existence of this book meant to me. It was the only hope I could find in the Vineyard at that time. And from this time forward, I began listening to the online services at SCC religiously. I still tried to make it work with the Vineyard Institute thing, but I quickly realized it wasn't what I was looking for. So one day, I went onto SSU's old website and I started exploring the ministry degree. To my surprise and delight, another so-called heretic I loved and still do, Brad Jerzak, was one of the professors. Now, this is not lip service. At that time in my life, if I could have handpicked any two theologians to learn from, it would have been the two of them. There was also a Walter Thiessen and a Leonard Jones on the instructor list, who I didn't know, but I would soon add them to my personal all-star list as well. I sent an inquiry email to SSU, and Debbie promptly responded as she does. And before I knew it, Peter Fitch's name popped up on my phone. He was calling to discuss the program, and I nearly died. I actually froze and didn't answer the phone the first time that happened. So then I had to call back, which might have been worse. In the fall of 2016, I showed up at SSU and at St. Croix Vineyard, believing it was a safe place for my longings because I'd been listening. A lot has happened since then. It hasn't been seamless or easy at all. We've experienced the pain of losing a church community, followed by a global pandemic, and many other ups and downs. St. Croix Vineyard became St. Croix Church after the Vineyard's decision to draw a firm line, which did not include affirming our LGBTQ+ siblings, whom we simply cannot flourish or be whole without. This was devastating for many of us and caused unspeakable pain. But I think some pretty remarkable things have happened too. This week, Walter wrote a letter to all the people who stood with St. Croix Church as they stepped away from the vineyard, and I asked his permission to read it today. So I'll do that now. He writes, "It seems like it was in another world, but in the months before the pandemic, our church, St. Croix Vineyard, was being asked to leave Vineyard Churches Canada because of our belief and practice in performing same-sex marriages and celebrating full inclusion and affirmation of our LGBTQ+ family, friends, and neighbors. We took the step of creating a website and asking folks who supported our approach to join us as we leave. We wanted to make a statement that the loss to the Vineyard movement was not the simple dismissal of a small renegade community. Rather, it was a painful exclusion of LGBTQ+ Christians and those who wanted to fully welcome them. It was an action with serious ripples that would extend far beyond our little corner of New Brunswick. Your small step of solidarity with us helped get this message out, and it was noted in various ways, including among local media that was very positive about what was happening here. We trust that the message was also heard among church leaders. At that time, we planned 2 events that would mark our leaving. First, an evening of stories, songs, and lament from LGBTQ+ voices that we referred to as queerly grafted, followed by our Sunday service that was meant to have the feel of a jazz funeral, moving from pain to celebration as we announced the new name of our church. But days before this weekend, the pandemic was announced. We were still able to have the queerly grafted event, though it was small and somewhat muted by the precautions. But if you haven't checked it out yet, you can still see a record of the event here. Though this website will only be available for a couple more weeks. I'll link that in this talk. The Sunday service the next day, March 15th, was even more muted as the gravity of the pandemic was sinking in. Quietly, we announced that we would henceforth be known simply as St. Croix Church. Then a different kind of solidarity was forced on the world, and things shut down, and the effects of this are, of course, very much still with us. The Celtic early service moved our simple liturgical service online, and we are still meeting on Zoom on Sunday mornings. One surprise blessing has been the participation of friends and family who live far from St. Stephen. Even when we've been able to gather again in the SCC Cafe, we've kept the Zoom connection going to welcome those near or far who couldn't come otherwise. Our main second service has sometimes met indoors with restrictions, sometimes met outdoors beside the community garden, and sometimes we've simply made recorded messages available. Whatever we're able to do, we've been recording them and making them available online. We're also looking ahead to the future, and we've recently invited a group of relatively younger folk to become an imagination team, dreaming of new ways in which we can be a church community in the years ahead. It took a while for legalities to work through, but St. Croix Church did in fact become our legal name since the winter of 2020. We know that other churches in the Vineyard and other evangelical movements have taken similar stances of affirmation and resistance to their governing bodies. We know this liberation will continue to unfold, but we continue to grieve with those it hurts in the meantime. Thanks to all of you for being a part of both the grieving and the celebration with us. Thanks for being a part of the liberating of the church. May the Spirit of God continue to help us prioritize living with love for all of our neighbors. Peace. Walter Thiessen for St. Croix Church. I've spent some time looking through that website this week, remembering the significance of this event. It happened before we moved here, which was later in the year. And just reflecting on what it means to continue being faithful to the longing of the Spirit within me. I know this is a lifelong journey. Today, as I reflect on all of this, I know that one thing I long for now is to provide a safe spiritual home for others, the way St. Croix Church has for me. I long for this because I know how important it is. I know how lonely we become without it. And I understand more fully what happens inside us when we ignore our longings, how we lose touch with such important parts of ourselves. So to close, I've been working my way through Beth Allison Barr's book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, lately. And I think she does such a good job of tracing the through lines of what needs to be cracked open in our theology and in the church. Riffing off a quote from a film, she counters the character's statement, quote, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist," with this, quote, "I haven't forgotten that line because I disagree with it. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing Christians that oppression is godly," end quote. Now, I know that isn't a beautiful place to end here, but it is faithful to the cracks in the church that continue to call me near. I offer it to you as something to grapple with, because I believe in the grappling. So many of us in the church are grappling in ways we should. So whatever the cracks are for you, I bless the work they are doing in you. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Bless you.